In a world where empires rose and vanished like waves upon the sea, one realm defied time itself, an empire of marble and faith, of golden light and eternal struggle. This is the story of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, a civilization that stood between heaven and earth, between ancient Greece and modern Europe, between the cross and the crescent. From the dreams of Constantine the Great, who built a new Rome upon the Bosporus, to the glory of Justinian and Theodora, who forged cathedrals of light while empires trembled, Byzantium was not just a kingdom of men, but a vision of the divine. For over 1,000 years, its people stood as the guardians of civilization, preserving the knowledge of Plato and Aristotle, defending the faith through fire and war, and filling the world with mosaics that still glow with the color of eternity. Yet its story is not only of triumph, but of tragedy, of crusaders who turned upon their brothers, of emperors who fought against fate, and of a city whose golden domes finally fell beneath the shadow of the crescent moon. But even in ruin, Byzantium refused to die. Its scholars carried the seeds of the Renaissance to the West. Its faith found new life in the Orthodox East. Its spirit rose again in the domes of Moscow, in the chants of Athens, and in the laws, art, and dreams of the modern world. On this journey through 20 chapters of history, we will walk through the halls of emperors, the deserts of conquest, the sanctuaries of monks, and the final battle where one man, Constantine XI, chose to die as an emperor of Rome rather than live as a slave of fate. You are watching History Teller YT, and this is the Byzantine Empire, Rome's Eastern legacy, a saga of light that refused to fade, a civilization reborn through its fall, the empire that never truly died. When the Roman Empire stretched from the misty forests of Britain to the scorching deserts of Egypt, it was clear that no single ruler could manage such vast dominion. Administrative complexity, constant invasions, and the pressure of governance led Emperor Diocletian in 285 CE to divide the empire into East and West. What began as an act of efficiency would unknowingly birth one of history's longest-lasting empires. The eastern half, centered around the wealthy and strategic city of Byzantium, later Constantinople, was richer, more urbanized, and far more stable than the declining West. Greek language, Hellenistic philosophy, and ancient Roman law intermingled, creating a unique cultural fusion. As the Western Empire would crumble under barbarian invasions, the East quietly evolved into something new, a Christian, Greek-speaking empire that still called itself Roman. Thus began the story of the Byzantine Empire, not a successor, but a continuation of Rome itself. In the early 4th century, the Roman world was torn by civil war and chaos. Then emerged a man who would forever change the course of Christian and imperial history, Constantine the Great. After his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, guided, he believed, by divine intervention, Constantine embraced Christianity, ending centuries of persecution. He envisioned a new imperial capital, not in the decaying West, but at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. In 330 CE, he dedicated the city of Nova Roma, soon known as Constantinople. Built upon ancient Byzantium, it became the city of the world's desire. Constantine filled it with grand forums, shimmering palaces, and majestic churches. He merged Roman imperial authority with Christian spirituality, creating the foundation of an empire that would outlive Rome by 1,000 years. Constantinople became the heartbeat of Eastern Christendom, Rome reborn in marble and faith. Constantine's reign marked a seismic shift in world history, the transformation of a pagan empire into a Christian one. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted freedom of worship, ending centuries of bloodshed against Christians. Temples to ancient gods gave way to basilicas and crosses. Bishops became imperial advisors, and theology began to shape politics. But this transformation was not smooth. Pagan traditions still thrived, and many Romans resisted what they saw as betrayal of the old gods. Yet Christianity's organizational strength, its unity, literacy, and moral vision, proved irresistible. The empire's identity shifted from conquest to faith, from Jupiter's thunderbolt to Christ's cross. This fusion of Roman law, Greek intellect, and Christian faith would define Byzantium's character for the next millennium. A civilization at once earthly and divine, rational and mystical, imperial and spiritual. From the moment Constantine declared his new capital, Constantinople was destined to be unlike any other city in the world. Perched on the narrow Bosporus Strait, it linked Europe and Asia, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, a bridge between continents and cultures. The city's strategic position gave it immense power over trade, war, and diplomacy. Merchant ships from Venice, Alexandria, and Antioch filled its harbors, bringing silk, spices, and silver. Massive walls encircled the city, first by Constantine and later expanded by Theodosius II, creating an impregnable fortress that would defy invaders for 1,000 years. Within these walls stood forums lined with statues of emperors, glittering fountains, and towering obelisks taken from Egypt. At the heart of the city lay the Great Palace, where mosaics sparkled under torchlight and imperial guards from distant lands stood watch. Constantinople was not only a political capital, but a spiritual one, God's city on earth, as chroniclers called it. When travelers arrived by sea, the city rose before them like a vision of paradise, golden domes catching the morning sun, a symbol of divine favor and imperial glory. It was not just Rome reborn. It was something more refined, more eternal, a vision of heaven itself rendered in stone and marble. As Constantinople's influence grew, so too did its role as the guardian of Christianity. The 4th and 5th centuries were marked by fierce debates about Christ's nature, the Holy Trinity, and the unity of the Church. Emperors convened great councils to decide questions of doctrine, gatherings that would shape Christianity for millennia. The Council of Nicaea, 325, initiated by Constantine himself, established the foundational creed of faith, Christ as both fully divine and fully human. Yet controversies continued to erupt: Arianism, Nestorianism, Monophysitism, each threatening to split the Church and the empire. Byzantine emperors often found themselves acting as both rulers and theologians, trying to preserve political stability through spiritual unity. Bishops, monks, and scholars filled Constantinople's streets with argument and prayer, while monasteries across the empire became sanctuaries of learning. The Church's power was no longer confined to the altar. It was now intertwined with the throne. The Byzantine idea of symphonia, harmony between church and state, became the guiding principle of governance. This divine partnership gave the empire moral authority, but also sowed seeds of future tension. For the Byzantines, however, faith and empire were inseparable, both instruments of God's will on earth, shining together beneath the golden dome of the imperial city. By the late 4th century, Constantine's dream had become a living reality. Pagan temples had faded into memory, and Christian churches rose in their place, each one a monument to the triumph of faith. The empire's laws, art, and education all reflected a new moral order grounded in Christian ideals. The Latin tongue of Rome slowly gave way to Greek, and with it, the philosophical depth of Hellenistic thought merged with biblical revelation. A unique civilization emerged, one that valued both logic and mysticism, law and mercy, empire and eternity. Education thrived in Constantinople's schools, where rhetoric and philosophy were taught alongside scripture. Artists decorated church walls with glittering mosaics of saints and angels, turning worship into a visual symphony of color and light. The people of the empire began to see themselves not as Romans of old, but as Romaoi, heirs to Rome's authority, but subjects of Christ's kingdom. The Byzantine worldview placed the emperor beneath God, but above all earthly powers, protector of the true faith and ruler of the civilized world. In this vision, politics was sacred, and art was a form of prayer. Thus, by the dawn of the 5th century, the Byzantine Empire had established a new model of civilization, one that would preserve the flame of Roman order and Christian faith long after the Western Empire fell into darkness. When Emperor Justinian ascended the throne in 527 CE, the Byzantine Empire was powerful but uncertain, threatened by external enemies and internal corruption. Yet within him burned an ambition unmatched by any ruler since Constantine. Justinian envisioned nothing less than the restoration of the old Roman Empire, not just in territory, but in spirit, law, and glory. He was born to humble origins in the Balkans, yet his intelligence and piety elevated him to the pinnacle of power. Once emperor, he launched sweeping reforms to centralize authority, purify the administration, and revive Rome's majesty. His most enduring achievement was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, a monumental codification of centuries of Roman legal tradition. Compiled by his brilliant jurist Tribonian, it distilled chaos into order, logic, and moral clarity. These laws defined property rights, justice, and imperial power, influencing legal systems for over a millennium, from Europe's courts to modern civil codes. But Justinian was not only a reformer, he was a conqueror. His generals, especially the legendary Belisarius, marched west to reclaim the lost provinces of Africa, Italy, and even parts of Spain. For a fleeting moment, his dream seemed real. The Mediterranean once again shone as Mare Nostrum, our sea. Yet this dream came at a cost: staggering taxes, exhausted armies, and restless subjects. Still, to Justinian, empire was divine duty. He ruled as God's vicegerent, believing that he had been chosen to restore the harmony of heaven on earth through law, architecture, and faith. Behind Justinian's iron stood an equally formidable partner, his wife, Theodora. Her story was unlike any other empress in history. Born the daughter of a bear trainer, she began her life as an actress, a profession considered scandalous in Byzantine society. But Theodora possessed brilliance, courage, and charisma that transcended her origins. When Justinian met her, he found not just a companion, but a kindred soul. After their marriage, she became his most trusted advisor and the empire's co-ruler. In council meetings, she spoke with confidence, often swaying decisions of state and faith. Her intellect was matched by her fierce resolve. During the Nika Revolt of 532, when mobs filled Constantinople shouting, "Down with Justinian," the emperor considered fleeing the city. It was Theodora who stood firm, declaring, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Her courage rekindled his resolve. Together, they crushed the rebellion, leaving 30,000 dead in the Hippodrome. Yet Theodora's influence was not limited to politics. She championed women's rights, enacting laws to protect them from exploitation, granting mothers guardianship over their children, and outlawing forced prostitution. She also played a major role in religious affairs, supporting the Monophysite Christians against the imperial orthodoxy, a move that revealed her independent spirit. To the Byzantine people, Theodora embodied the empire's paradox. Born in sin, crowned in sanctity, a sinner turned saint, a woman wielding power in a man's world. Together, Justinian and Theodora became a symbol of divine partnership, ruling not merely as emperor and empress, but as chosen vessels of God's purpose. After the fires of the Nika Revolt reduced much of Constantinople to ashes, Justinian saw opportunity in disaster. From ruin, he would raise a monument that would embody the glory of God and the empire's eternal strength, the Hagia Sophia. In 537 CE, after only 5 years of feverish construction, the great church was completed. Designed by the mathematician Anthemius of Tralles and the physicist Isidore of Miletus, it defied the limits of ancient engineering. The massive dome, appearing to float upon a halo of light from 40 arched windows, stunned all who entered. "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," Justinian is said to have proclaimed, invoking the Temple of Jerusalem. The Hagia Sophia was more than architecture. It was theology carved in stone, a cosmic vision of heaven on earth. Its shimmering mosaics, marble columns, and golden light inspired awe for centuries. Yet this divine beauty was built upon suffering. Thousands of laborers toiled day and night. Heavy taxes broke the backs of farmers and merchants. Then came the plague of 541, the first great pandemic of recorded history. Fleas carried by rats brought death to Constantinople, killing perhaps half the population, including Theodora herself in later years. Justinian fell ill but survived, his body weakened, yet his will unbroken. His empire, however, was scarred. The conquests he had won slipped away, the treasury emptied, the streets filled with silence and fear. And yet the Hagia Sophia endured, a miracle of endurance and faith. It stood as the ultimate expression of Byzantine resilience. From ruin, beauty; from chaos, order; from mortality, the vision of eternity. By the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire had survived wars, plagues, and revolts, yet it faced an even deeper struggle, one for the soul of its faith. Christianity had long been the empire's lifeblood, but as it grew in wealth and complexity, spiritual divisions began to fester. Central to this crisis was the use of icons, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. To many believers, icons were more than art. They were windows into the divine, helping the faithful feel God's presence in a world of suffering. Churches glittered with mosaic halos and golden faces that seemed to gaze back with compassion. But others condemned them as idolatry, accusing the church of betraying the commandment against graven images. By the 8th century, the conflict exploded into the iconoclast controversy. Emperor Leo III, facing Muslim pressure from the East and internal instability, believed divine wrath had fallen upon Byzantium because of its idols. In 726, he ordered the destruction of icons throughout the empire. Soldiers stormed churches, smashing images, tearing down mosaics, and silencing monks who resisted. For over a century, the empire was torn apart by this war of faith. Families divided, monasteries burned, and the church fractured between iconoclasts, image breakers, and iconodules, image venerators. The conflict was not merely religious, but political, a battle for who held authority over the sacred, emperor or church. When Empress Irene finally restored icons in 787 at the Second Council of Nicaea, peace returned, but Byzantium was forever changed. It had learned that spiritual zeal could both sustain and endanger the empire. Even as the empire fought its internal wars of faith, a new force was rising beyond its borders, swift, united, and guided by an unshakable belief in one God. The birth of Islam in the 7th century transformed the geopolitical map of the world. Within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Arab armies surged across the Near East, conquering Persia, Syria, and Egypt, once the richest provinces of Byzantium. Cities like Damascus and Alexandria fell like stars from the imperial sky. The Byzantines, long accustomed to fighting Persia, were stunned by the speed and fervor of this new enemy. The Muslim caliphates brought both sword and scripture, seeing their victories as divine will. The empire's loss of Egypt was especially devastating, for it had been Constantinople's granary and a center of theology. Yet Byzantium did not collapse. Under Emperor Heraclius and his successors, it reorganized its army into themes, military districts governed by soldier farmers loyal to both land and faith. From the Taurus Mountains to the Aegean, fortresses rose like stone sentinels guarding the empire's heart. The Byzantines fought back with cunning as much as courage. They deployed the mysterious weapon known as Greek fire, a flaming liquid that clung to ships and men alike, burning even on water. When Arab fleets besieged Constantinople in 717, Emperor Leo III unleashed Greek fire upon them, and the sea itself seemed to turn into fire. For the next 7 centuries, the empire stood as a shield between Europe and the expanding Islamic world, a living wall of faith, intellect, and endurance. While armies clashed on the borders, Byzantium's heart pulsed with intellectual and spiritual creativity. It was not only an empire of swords, but of minds. The monasteries of Mount Athos, the libraries of Constantinople, and the schools of Antioch became centers of philosophy, theology, and art. Scholars preserved the wisdom of Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates, ensuring that the treasures of classical Greece survived the dark ages of the West. At the same time, Byzantine theologians refined doctrines that still define Christian thought. The dual nature of Christ, the mystery of the Trinity, and the role of the Virgin Mary as Theotokos, the God-bearer. Art became theology in color and light. Mosaics of Christ Pantocrator gazed from domes with eyes of compassion and judgment. The faithful prayed surrounded by gold that shimmered like heaven. This fusion of intellect and devotion created what historians call the Byzantine synthesis, the perfect blend of reason, order, and mystical faith. The empire's identity became inseparable from its religion. Every triumph was God's favor, every defeat his test. Byzantium believed itself chosen, a nation standing at the edge of eternity. The emperor ruled as God's earthly representative. Priests and philosophers interpreted his will. In this balance of power, beauty, and belief lay the secret of Byzantium's endurance. Even as empires rose and fell around it, the Byzantines continued to think, pray, and build, believing that as long as the candles burned in Hagia Sophia, the light of the true faith would never die. While Byzantium's gaze was often fixed on Persia and the Arab Caliphate to the east, a new wave of threats emerged from the north. Wild, restless tribes that surged like storm clouds across the Danube frontier. In the late 6th and 7th centuries, the empire faced the arrival of the Slavs and the Bulgars, peoples whose migrations would reshape the Balkans forever. For centuries, the northern border along the Great River had been a defensive shield, guarded by fortresses, watchtowers, and garrisons of battle-hardened soldiers. But as the empire weakened from wars and plagues, that shield cracked. Slavic tribes, hardy farmers and warriors, poured into the Balkan lands, settling among the ruins of Roman towns, cultivating fields, and founding villages in lands once dominated by imperial estates. At first, the Byzantines viewed them as raiders, barbarians to be expelled, but the Slavs were not easily dislodged. They adapted, learned, and multiplied, carving out a permanent presence in Mysia, Thrace, and Macedonia. Soon after came the Bulgars, a Turkic-speaking people led by their Khans, fierce horsemen from the steppes north of the Black Sea. In 681 CE, The Bulgar leader Asparuk defeated a Byzantine army and forced Emperor Constantine IV to sign a humiliating treaty recognizing a new Bulgarian state south of the Danube. The first time Byzantium had acknowledged an independent nation on its soil. For an empire that saw itself as eternal and universal, this was an alarming humiliation. The northern frontier, once Rome's natural barrier, had become a breeding ground for new kingdoms that would challenge Byzantine power for centuries to come. Over the following centuries, the Bulgars evolved from nomadic warriors into a sophisticated kingdom influenced deeply by Byzantine culture, religion, and diplomacy. The early clashes between Constantinople and Pliska, the first Bulgarian capital, were brutal. Campaigns by emperors like Nicephorus I and Krum turned the Balkans into a wasteland of burning cities and shattered armies. In 811, Nicephorus invaded Bulgaria and captured Pliska, only to be ambushed on his retreat. Krum annihilated the Byzantine army and, in one of the most terrifying episodes in medieval history, used the emperor's skull as a jeweled drinking cup, a grim reminder that divine favor was not always with the Romans. Yet Byzantium never relied solely on the sword. It wielded something even more powerful: faith and culture. Through missionaries, diplomacy, and trade, Byzantine civilization slowly penetrated the hearts of its former enemies. By the 9th century, under Khan Boris I, Bulgaria accepted Christianity, not from Rome, but from Constantinople. This conversion marked a triumph greater than any military victory. Byzantine priests taught literacy using the new Slavic script created by Saints Cyril and Methodius, based on Greek letters but adapted for the Slavic tongue. Monks translated scripture and liturgy, bringing the gospel in a language the people could understand. Thus, the empire extended its spiritual frontier even as its political borders shrank. Byzantium's greatest victories were often invisible, fought not on battlefields but in minds and souls. The Bulgars had once been destroyers of cities. Now they became defenders of a shared Christian civilization that owed its light to Constantinople. As the centuries turned, the Slavs of the Balkans, once scattered tribes, became nations shaped by the Byzantine model. The empire's missionaries, architects, and artists traveled north carrying not swords but scripture, icons, and the art of governance. The Slavic lands, from Bulgaria to Serbia and later to Kievan Rus, became fertile ground for Byzantine ideals. When Saints Cyril and Methodius carried Christianity to Moravia and beyond, they planted the seeds of a linguistic revolution. The Glagolitic alphabet, ancestor of the Cyrillic script still used by millions today. Through language, Byzantium extended its empire without conquest, weaving a web of faith, art, and diplomacy that reached deep into Eastern Europe. Churches rose in Slavic towns, their domes echoing the Hagia Sophia. Hymns in the vernacular replaced pagan chants. By the 10th century, Constantinople was seen not just as a city, but as the second Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the Orthodox world. The Slavs, once invaders, became Byzantium's spiritual heirs, defending the cross they had once scorned. Yet these conversions also sowed the seeds of future rivalry. As new Christian kingdoms matured, they sought independence, not eternal subservience. They borrowed Byzantine glory but refused its dominance. The empire, once unchallenged, found itself surrounded by former pupils turned competitors. Still, Byzantium's cultural influence endured. Its mosaics, liturgies, and laws radiated outward like ripples from a stone cast into history's river. Though borders shifted and empires rose and fell, the Byzantine soul lived on in the faith, language, and identity of the Slavic world it had once struggled to subdue. After centuries of wars, religious conflict, and territorial loss, the Byzantine Empire entered a remarkable period of revival under the Macedonian dynasty, beginning in 867 CE with the reign of Basil I. Born a peasant in the Balkans, Basil's rise to power was the stuff of legend, a tale of cunning, strength, and divine providence. Through a combination of intelligence and ambition, he rose from stable boy to imperial bodyguard and, eventually, emperor. His ascent symbolized the resilience of Byzantium itself, a state that, though battered by history, always found renewal in its own depths. Basil I consolidated imperial power, reformed the army, and restored prosperity. He also sought to revive the empire's Roman heritage by compiling new legal codes, expanding the city's defenses, and fostering the arts. Under his rule and that of his successors, particularly Leo VI the Wise and Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, Byzantium experienced what historians call the Macedonian Renaissance, an era of political stability, economic recovery, and intellectual rebirth. Constantinople flourished as the richest city in the world, filled with scholars, merchants, and artists from every corner of the known earth. The empire's borders expanded once more. Armenia, Crete, and parts of Syria returned to imperial control. The Byzantine fleet dominated the Aegean, while the imperial court became a stage of breathtaking ceremony and divine symbolism. The emperor was hailed as God's chosen ruler, a reflection of heavenly order. After centuries of turmoil, Byzantium stood radiant again, not merely surviving, but thriving, a beacon of civilization amid the darkness that shrouded medieval Europe. The Macedonian era was not just a political renaissance. It was an intellectual and artistic awakening that redefined Byzantine identity. In the monasteries of Mount Athos and the schools of Constantinople, scholars rediscovered the works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle, preserving the wisdom of ancient Greece for future generations. Manuscripts were copied with exquisite precision, illuminated with gold leaf and painted miniatures. Libraries expanded, and learning became both a civic duty and a form of worship. The emperors themselves were scholars. Leo VI, called the Wise, wrote treatises on theology, law, and philosophy. His successor, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, authored De Administrando Imperio, a manual of diplomacy, geography, and politics that reveal the empire's extraordinary understanding of the world. Byzantine art, too, reached new heights. The mosaics of this era shimmered with spiritual symbolism, blending realism with divine abstraction. Figures were elongated and illuminated with golden backgrounds, representing humanity's ascent toward God. Churches like the Nea Ecclesia, New Church, and the Church of the Holy Apostles became masterpieces of sacred geometry and beauty. Music evolved into a form of devotion. Chants filled the air of the Hagia Sophia like waves of eternity. The capital itself became a living museum of marble, icons, and learning, a city where merchants, monks, and philosophers mingled in the same streets. The Byzantine worldview fused intellect and faith seamlessly. To study the cosmos was to understand God's will. This harmony between spiritual and rational life made the Macedonian Renaissance not only a revival of knowledge, but also a reaffirmation of Byzantium's eternal mission, to embody divine wisdom in the world of men. Even amid its cultural brilliance, the empire of the Macedonians was never far removed from the realities of war. The Byzantines, guided by both divine faith and military science, perfected the art of strategic warfare. Their generals, like Nikephoros Phokas and John Cymisks, expanded the empire's borders through disciplined campaigns. They reclaimed Crete from Muslim control, secured victories in Syria, and brought Aleppo under imperial influence. The reconquest of Antioch in 969 symbolized a restoration of Christian authority in lands once lost to Islam. Yet these conquests were not mere acts of ambition. They were viewed as sacred missions, a defense of the faith and a continuation of Rome's divine duty to maintain cosmic order. The Byzantine army was unmatched in organization and intelligence. Manuals like the Tactica outlined sophisticated strategies emphasizing mobility, deception, and psychological warfare. The empire's elite troops, the cataphracts, thundered into battle with armor that gleamed like mirrors, while Greek fire remained the terror of enemy fleets. But Byzantium's power also extended through diplomacy. Marriage alliances, bribes, and religious influence often achieved what armies could not. Missionaries continued to spread orthodoxy northward, especially into Kievan Rus, where Prince Vladimir's conversion to Christianity in 988 became a turning point for Eastern Europe. This union of politics and religion created an Orthodox world bound by faith, art, and allegiance to Constantinople. As the 10th century closed, Byzantium stood at its zenith. Wealthy, learned, and seemingly invincible. The Macedonian emperors had revived Rome's grandeur and fortified its soul. Yet beneath the glittering domes, new challenges stirred. Internal decadence, ambitious generals, and rising powers beyond the empire's frontiers. The Golden Age would not last forever, but its brilliance would echo through the centuries to come. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates stood as two great civilizations, rivals in faith, but mirrors in brilliance. On one side of the frontier rose the golden domes of Constantinople. On the other, the minarets of Baghdad, heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. Both saw themselves as the true heirs of divine wisdom. Their borders met in the mountains of Anatolia and the deserts of Syria, a frontier not just of armies, but of ideas, trade, and faith. Despite centuries of warfare, the two worlds were bound by fascination and exchange. Arab scholars translated Greek texts preserved by Byzantine monks, reviving Aristotle and Galen for the Islamic world. Byzantine merchants traded silk and silver for spices and scientific knowledge. Diplomats carried letters written in Greek and Arabic, each side watching the other with wary admiration. Yet beneath this fragile coexistence, the struggle for dominance was eternal. The Byzantines viewed themselves as defenders of the true faith, the last bastion of Christendom against the followers of the Prophet. The Muslims, in turn, saw Byzantium as the final stronghold of a corrupted Christianity. From the walls of Tarsus to the shores of Cilicia, holy wars and truces alternated in a rhythm that lasted generations. But this was no mindless conflict. It was a duel of civilizations, each believing it carried the light of divine truth into a world of darkness. Out of this contest emerged not only warfare, but a shared legacy of knowledge, art, and philosophy that would later shape Europe's rebirth. After the rapid Arab conquest of the 7th century, the early Islamic empires grew into sophisticated states with vast resources and inspired faith. The Umayyads of Damascus had struck deep into Byzantine lands, even besieging Constantinople twice, in 674 and 717, only to be turned back by the unyielding walls and the infernal brilliance of Greek fire. These sieges became legends, proof to the Byzantines of God's protection. The later Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, represented a more intellectual empire, patrons of science, poetry, and architecture. But they, too, maintained their sacred struggle against Byzantium. For centuries, the frontier between them shifted like a living flame. Byzantine generals such as Nikephoros Phokas and John Tsimisks, heirs of the Macedonian dynasty, launched bold offensives deep into Muslim territory. Cities like Aleppo, Antioch, and Tarsus changed hands repeatedly, their walls echoing with both the call to prayer and the chanting of Byzantine priests. These campaigns were not mere military maneuvers. They were expressions of faith. Each victory was hailed as divine favor, each defeat as penance for sin. Yet, as fierce as the conflict was, there existed an unspoken respect between the two powers. Captured Byzantine officers were often treated honorably. Envoys were exchanged with ceremony and gifts. The Byzantine court, fascinated by the luxury of Baghdad, adopted silks, perfumes, and scientific instruments that had originated in Persia and Arabia. The empire survived not through isolation, but through adaptation. By learning from its enemy, Byzantium remained vital, its faith unbroken, its culture ever renewed. While the wars between Byzantium and the caliphates often flared into open combat, much of their rivalry played out in subtler ways, through diplomacy, espionage, and symbolic gestures of supremacy. Emperors and caliphs sent envoys bearing silken letters written in gold ink, proclaiming their divine legitimacy. The Byzantine emperor styled himself Basilius of the Romans, while the caliph declared himself commander of the faithful. Both claimed to rule by God's will. Both saw the other as a false prophet's servant. Yet politics demanded pragmatism. Treaties were signed, hostages exchanged, and prisoners ransomed at the banks of the Lamos River. Border towns like Melitene and Tarsus became hubs of intrigue, where spies, merchants, and monks mingled in secret. The Byzantines perfected the art of psychological warfare, bribing rival emirs, funding rebellions, and using marriage alliances to destabilize Islamic unity. Meanwhile, the empire's intelligence network, the Bureau of Barbarians, gathered reports from every court from Baghdad to Cordoba. The Byzantines also used religion as a diplomatic weapon. They portrayed themselves as protectors of Eastern Christians living under Muslim rule, sending letters to the caliphs demanding fair treatment for their brethren. This moral posturing enhanced the empire's spiritual prestige even when its armies faltered. By the 11th century, however, a new and more dangerous enemy emerged. The Seljuk Turks, warriors of the steppe converted to Islam, who would strike at the empire's very heart. The long duel between Cross and Crescent was about to enter its most violent and transformative phase. Byzantium had withstood the storms of centuries, but the winds of destiny were shifting. The age of classical empires was ending, and a new chapter of faith and fire was about to begin. By the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood proud but weary. Its borders stretched wide. Its court glittered with ceremony, yet its armies were thin and its provinces restless. Into this delicate world rode a new and formidable power, the Seljuk Turks. Originating from the vast steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuks were nomadic warriors, masters of the horse and the bow, united by the banner of Islam. Fierce, disciplined, and inspired by faith, they surged westward, toppling old powers and carving new dominions from Persia to Mesopotamia. In 1055, they entered Baghdad, proclaiming themselves protectors of the Abbasid Caliphate and defenders of Sunni Islam. For the Byzantine world, this marked the dawn of a terrifying new era. Unlike the Arabs, who fought in predictable campaigns, the Turks moved like shadows, swift, elusive, and merciless. Their raids across Anatolia burned villages, shattered fortresses, and scattered armies unprepared for their lightning tactics. The empire's ancient heartland, Asia Minor, cradle of Hellenic and Christian civilization, now trembled under the hooves of the invaders. The Byzantine emperors, caught in political intrigue and civil wars, underestimated the danger. In Constantinople, courtiers debated theology and ceremony, while on the frontier, entire provinces fell into chaos. Yet among the Turks, a leader arose whose genius and restraint would define the coming age. Alp Arslan, meaning heroic lion. Under his rule, the Seljuks forged a disciplined state rooted in both Islamic faith and steppe tradition. He did not seek mere plunder, he sought dominion, and his gaze turned toward the empire of the Romans. Byzantium, once the unshakable fortress of the East, was about to face an enemy unlike any it had ever known. In the Byzantine capital, a new emperor sought to reclaim the empire's fading power. Romanos for Diogenes, a soldier of noble lineage but little experience with court intrigue. Rising to power in 1068 through marriage to the widowed Empress Eudokia, Romanos inherited a divided empire and a complacent army. Determined to defend his realm, he embarked on a campaign to restore discipline and confront the Seljuks head-on. Yet his efforts were undermined from within. The Byzantine aristocracy, bloated with privilege, resented his reforms. Provincial governors ignored his commands, and rival generals plotted behind his back. Even as Romanos prepared for war, treachery brewed in his own camp. In 1071, he gathered one of the largest Byzantine armies in a century. Soldiers from Greece, Armenia, Bulgaria, and mercenaries from as far as Normandy and Pecheneg lands. His goal was to strike deep into eastern Anatolia and reclaim the fortress city of Manzikert, near Lake Van. But fate had already written its cruel script. Unknown to Romanos, Alp Arslan was also marching toward the same city. His army smaller, but united in faith and loyalty. The Byzantines, overconfident and disorganized, split their forces, a fatal mistake. As Romanos advanced, his scouts brought news of the Seljuk army's approach. Rather than retreat, he chose to fight, convinced that victory would restore his honor and the empire's prestige. What followed was a confrontation that would echo through the ages, a battle that would shatter Byzantine supremacy in the east and open the gates of Anatolia to the Turks forever. On the fateful day of August 26th, 1071, near the dusty plains of Manzikert, the armies of Byzantium and the Seljuks faced one another under a blazing sun. The Byzantines, numbering perhaps 40,000, stood in glittering ranks of mail and steel. The Turks, half as many, rode in swift formations, their banners fluttering with Quranic verses. The battle began with the thunder of hooves and the whistling of arrows. The Seljuks' feigned retreat, a tactic perfected over generations of steppe warfare. The Byzantine lines pursued, breaking formation, only to be enveloped by the Turks' circling cavalry. Arrows rained down like a storm of death. Confusion spread, discipline collapsed. As night approached, the emperor himself fought at the center, rallying his men beneath the imperial standard. Then came betrayal. Andronikos Doukas, commander of the reserve and rival of Romanos, withdrew his troops at the critical moment, abandoning the emperor to disaster. Surrounded and wounded, Romanos was captured. In an extraordinary act of chivalry, Alp Arslan treated him with honor, even offering him water and release after negotiations. Yet the damage was irreversible. The Byzantine army was annihilated, its reputation destroyed. The loss of Manzikert was more than a military defeat. It was the beginning of the end of Byzantine Asia Minor, the empire's heartland. Villages emptied, fortresses fell, and Turkish tribes poured into the highlands, founding new emirates that would evolve into the Sultanate of Rome. For the Byzantines, Manzikert was a wound that never healed, a reminder that arrogance, division, and betrayal could destroy even a 1,000-year empire. The balance of power in the East had shifted forever, and from the ashes of this catastrophe, new forces would rise, crusaders, emperors, and conquerors who would reshape the destiny of the medieval world. In the aftermath of Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire lay broken, bleeding, and humiliated. The proud heartland of Anatolia, once the empire's breadbasket and recruiting ground, had fallen into chaos. Turkish warlords carved the land into small emirates, while imperial control shrank to a narrow corridor stretching from Constantinople to the Aegean coast. Civil wars erupted among ambitious generals and scheming aristocrats, each seeking to seize the throne from the weakened center. By the late 11th century, the once mighty empire seemed ready to crumble. Yet amid despair arose a ruler of courage and vision, Alexios I Komnenos. Crowned emperor in 1081, Alexios inherited a realm surrounded by enemies. The Normans in the west, the Pecheneg in the north, and the Seljuks in the east. Realizing that the empire could no longer stand alone, he turned to an unlikely ally, the Latin West. Though relations between Rome and Constantinople had been poisoned by the Great Schism of 1054, Alexios saw no alternative. He sent envoys to Pope Urban II, appealing for military aid against the Turks. His request was modest: a few thousand professional soldiers to help recover lost lands. But history answered with a tidal wave. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Urban II proclaimed a holy war, a crusade to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. What began as a Byzantine call for help would unleash a movement that reshaped two continents, uniting knights, peasants, and princes under the banner of the cross. For Byzantium, salvation was coming, but not in the form it expected. The empire was about to invite into its house the very forces that would one day tear it apart. When the call of the cross echoed through Europe, it ignited a fire that no ruler could control. From the fields of France to the castles of Germany, thousands of men and women took the vow of the crusader. Some were driven by faith, others by greed, adventure, or desperation. Whole families sold their homes to join the march to Jerusalem, believing that their journey would wash away sins and secure eternal salvation. But before these noble armies arrived, a far more chaotic host descended upon Byzantium, the People's Crusade. Led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit, tens of thousands of peasants and zealots stormed eastward in 1096, untrained and undisciplined. They ravaged Byzantine lands, mistaking Christians for infidels, until Alexios hurriedly ferried them across the Bosporus, where they were promptly massacred by the Turks. Soon, however, the real crusading armies began to arrive, disciplined knights under leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse. Constantinople trembled at their sight. Alexios, ever the strategist, welcomed them with gifts but demanded oaths of fealty, promises that any reconquered lands would return to imperial control. The Crusader princes, suspicious but pragmatic, agreed. Together, the armies moved across Anatolia, recapturing Nicaea and defeating the Turks at Dorylaeum. Yet beneath the banners of Christ, mistrust simmered. The Latins saw the Byzantines as scheming and decadent. The Greeks viewed the Crusaders as barbaric and ungovernable. Still, their shared purpose carried them forward, through fire, hunger, and blood, toward the gates of the Holy Land. For Alexios, the alliance was working. Byzantine banners once again flew over lost cities, and Anatolia began to breathe anew. But he also sensed that the storm he had unleashed would one day turn back toward him. By 1099, after years of unimaginable hardship, the The crusading armies reached Jerusalem. The city, sacred to three faiths, fell after a brutal siege. The crusaders wept, prayed, and then slaughtered, an orgy of violence that shocked even contemporaries. The Holy Sepulchre was drenched in blood, but the cross had triumphed. Out of conquest rose a new world. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. To Western eyes, this was the fulfillment of divine destiny. To Byzantium, it was a mixed blessing. Alexios had regained some territory and prestige, but he now faced new Latin neighbors who were as ambitious as they were pious. The Prince Bohemond of Antioch, once his ally, turned against him, declaring independence from the empire and launching campaigns in the Balkans. Byzantine diplomats scrambled to maintain control through negotiation and intrigue. The empire became a web of alliances, sometimes aiding the Crusaders, sometimes their Muslim foes, always seeking to preserve balance. This uneasy coexistence defined the new era. The Byzantine emperors saw the Crusaders as both saviors and usurpers, men who had revived Christian arms but shattered imperial authority in the East. Yet the First Crusade also bought Byzantium time. It delayed Turkish expansion and gave Alexios the breathing space to rebuild his armies, finances, and fortifications. Under his rule, the empire rose again from near ruin, though now standing on fragile foundations. The cross and the crescent still faced one another, but a new tension had entered the story, the rivalry between Greek and Latin Christendom. The very allies who had once answered Byzantium's plea would, within a century, return not as helpers, but as conquerors. By the early 12th century, the Byzantine Empire had regained a measure of strength under the Comnenian dynasty. Yet the relationship with the West, once based on faith and shared struggle, had soured into suspicion. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, whose plea for help had sparked the First Crusade, had rebuilt his armies, restored the treasury, and stabilized the borders. His successors, John II and Manuel I, continued his vision, combining diplomacy, warfare, and marriage alliances to hold together the empire's fragile resurgence. Under their reigns, Constantinople once again gleamed as the jewel of the East, its churches adorned with gold mosaics, its markets teeming with silk, spices, and scholars from every corner of the world. Western visitors marveled at its wealth, but whispered with envy. The Latins, accustomed to the rough austerity of feudal Europe, viewed Byzantium's sophistication as decadence. To the Byzantines, the Crusaders were crude mercenaries, men of violence cloaked in piety. Despite these tensions, the Comnenian emperors maintained a delicate balance, playing rival Western powers against one another while holding off the Turks in Anatolia. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, in particular, sought to bridge the cultural divide, even adopting Western customs, justs, and chivalric titles. Yet his fascination with the West alarmed his own nobles and clergy, who feared Latin influence. As the 12th century unfolded, the empire's strength depended more on personality than institution. When strong emperors ruled, Byzantium flourished. When weak ones reigned, it teetered. After Manuel's death in 1180, internal strife, foreign intrigue, and economic exhaustion began to unravel the stability his dynasty had built. The empire had survived the Seljuks and the Arabs, but now would face its most devastating foe, fellow Christians bearing the banner of the cross. By the dawn of the 13th century, the spirit of crusading had changed. What began as a holy pilgrimage had turned into a tool of politics, greed, and vengeance. In 1202, Pope Innocent III proclaimed the Fourth Crusade, intending to strike at Egypt, the heart of Muslim power and from there liberate Jerusalem. Yet the crusade was born under a shadow. Lacking funds to pay for their transport, the Crusader lords struck a deal with the powerful Republic of Venice, whose merchant fleet would carry them east in exchange for military service and gold. The Venetians, shrewd and calculating, soon redirected the Crusaders' zeal toward their own political ends. Instead of marching on Egypt, the Crusaders attacked Zara, a Christian city and rival Venetian port, sacking it in 1202 despite papal condemnation. From there, fate and manipulation led them toward Constantinople. A deposed Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, promised vast rewards and submission to the Pope if the Crusaders helped him reclaim his father's throne. Hungry for wealth and absolution, the Crusaders agreed. When they reached the imperial city in 1203, its golden domes shone over the Marmara like a vision of paradise. But behind those walls, fear and fury simmered. The Byzantines saw the Latins not as liberators, but as invaders. The restored emperor, Alexios IV, could not fulfill his promises, lacking the gold and authority to pay his Western benefactors. Tensions exploded. By early 1204, the Crusaders and Venetians, betrayed and impatient, turned their swords not against Islam, but against the greatest Christian city on earth. The Holy War had become a war for plunder. In April 1204, the unthinkable happened. The armies of Christendom, once called to defend the faith, turned upon their own Sacred Heart. As dawn broke, the Venetian fleet advanced toward the sea walls of Constantinople, their sails emblazoned with crimson crosses. Latin knights stormed the landward gates, hurling ladders and fire. For 2 days, the city's defenders held firm, but the empire's strength was spent, its people divided, its leaders treacherous, its treasury empty. On the 3rd day, the Crusaders breached the walls. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in medieval history. Constantinople, the second Rome, was consumed by fire and chaos. Churches were looted, relics desecrated, and sacred icons smashed. The great Hagia Sophia, crown of Christian architecture, was stripped of its golden altar and turned into a stable for horses. Monks were slain before their icons. Women, noble and humble alike, were violated in the shadow of the cross. The treasure of a millennium, silks, jewels, manuscripts, and sacred relics, vanished into the coffers of Venice and Western Europe. Even the bronze horses of the Hippodrome were carried off to St. Mark's Basilica, where they still stand today. When the flames died, the Byzantine Empire was no more. In its place rose the Latin Empire of Constantinople, ruled by Western knights who could neither understand nor sustain the civilization they had destroyed. The Greek survivors fled to Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, where they kept the imperial flame alive in exile. For the first time in 9 centuries, the city of Constantine lay in foreign hands. The betrayal of 1204 was not just a political disaster. It was a spiritual wound that divided East and West forever. The dream of a united Christendom died in the ashes of Constantinople. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 did not merely destroy a city. It shattered an entire civilization. For the Byzantines, the loss of their capital was not just political, but cosmic. The empire had always seen itself as the earthly reflection of God's order, and now that order had been overturned by fellow Christians. As fires smoldered in the ruins of the Queen of Cities, the surviving nobles, scholars, and generals scattered across the remnants of the empire, founding new realms to preserve what remained of Roman dignity. 3 principal successor states emerged: the Empire of Nicaea in Western Anatolia, the despotate of Epirus in Greece, and the empire of Trebizond along the Black Sea coast. Each claimed to be the true heir of Byzantium. Each dreamt of reclaiming Constantinople. Among them, Nicaea, under the leadership of Theodore Lascaris, would become the strongest. In the fortified city of Nicaea, Byzantine refugees rebuilt a miniature empire, complete with imperial court, bureaucracy, and church hierarchy. They re-established schools, copied manuscripts, and trained soldiers, determined that the Roman flame would not die in exile. Meanwhile, the Latin Empire of Constantinople began to rot from within. Its Western rulers, alien to the culture they had conquered, could not win the loyalty of the Greek population or defend the city against enemies. Venice seized the richest ports, while the Crusader lords squabbled over spoils. In Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks pressed against the weakened borders. In the Balkans, Bulgarian armies surged south. The Latin Empire became a hollow shell, a relic built on greed and blood. In contrast, the exiled Byzantines of Nicaea grew stronger, united by faith and vengeance. Though the crown had fallen, the spirit of the empire endured, awaiting the day when the double-headed eagle would rise again over Constantinople's shattered walls. Under the successors of Theodore Lascaris, the Empire of Nicaea transformed from a refuge into a powerhouse. Its rulers, particularly John III Doukas Vatatzes, R. 1222 to 1254, combined military skill, economic reform, and diplomatic cunning to restore stability. John III reorganized agriculture, encouraging peasants to reclaim abandoned lands and reviving trade across the Aegean. He curbed the excesses of the aristocracy, promoted learning, and cultivated alliances with sympathetic Western powers, even marrying his son to a relative of the German emperor. Nicaea's scholars and monks became the torchbearers of Byzantine tradition. In the absence of their capital, they poured their energy into theology, literature, and education. The Patriarchate of Constantinople, relocated to Nicaea, continued to guide the Orthodox world, preserving the spiritual authority that the Latin Church had tried to claim. Artists developed a new, more emotional style of iconography, reflecting both suffering and hope, a theology of exile rendered in color and gold. Militarily, the Nicaeans proved formidable. They reclaimed much of Western Asia Minor and, by the mid-13th century, had encircled the Latin Empire. Yet they advanced carefully, preferring diplomacy and attrition over direct assault. Their emperors negotiated truces, exploited rivalries among the Crusader lords, and slowly tightened the noose around Constantinople. Meanwhile, in Epirus, another Greek principality vied for dominance, briefly capturing Thessalonica and claiming the imperial title. But internal strife and Bulgarian pressure weakened Epirus, leaving Nicaea as the only serious contender for restoration. By 1258, a new ruler, Michael VIII Palaiologos, rose to power, a man of ambition, brilliance, and ruthless determination. Under his leadership, the dream of reclaiming Constantinople would finally be realized. The centuries-old Roman legacy was about to reclaim its heart. In the summer of 1261, after nearly 6 decades of exile, the moment of destiny arrived. Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, having secured alliances and neutralized his rivals, saw an opportunity to strike. The Latin Empire, weakened by debt and disunity, had left Constantinople dangerously exposed. The Venetian fleet, its chief defense, was away on campaign, and the city's Latin garrison was small. Michael dispatched his general, Alexios Strategopoulos, with a modest force of just 800 soldiers to reconnoiter the area. Fate intervened. When Strategopoulos learned that the Venetian fleet was absent, he acted boldly. On the night of July 24th, 1261, his men crept through a hidden gate in the city walls, overwhelming the guards and seizing control before dawn. As news spread, the Latin inhabitants panicked and fled to their ships. When Michael VIII entered the city days later, he knelt before the ruined Hagia Sophia and wept. The great church, desecrated by the Crusaders, was reconsecrated with Orthodox liturgy, its golden dome once again echoing with hymns to Christ. Constantinople was Byzantine once more. The empire's restoration, though miraculous, was not without cost. The city lay in ruins, its population decimated, its palaces gutted, its treasury empty. Michael VIII devoted himself to rebuilding, repairing walls, reopening trade routes, and re-establishing diplomatic relations. Yet the glory of Old Byzantium would never fully return. The empire had survived, but it was now smaller, poorer, and surrounded by new powers. The rising Ottoman Turks, the Serbians, and the Venetian merchants who still controlled much of the Aegean. Still, for one brief, shining moment, the ancient dream had come true. The double-headed eagle soared again above the city of Constantine, a symbol of faith enduring through ruin. The empire reborn from its own ashes, a phoenix against the tide of history. The recapture of Constantinople in 1261 was hailed as a miracle, the resurrection of a thousand-year empire. Bells rang, hymns soared through the Hagia Sophia, and for a brief instant, Byzantium felt immortal again. Yet behind the jubilation lay exhaustion. The empire Michael VIII Palaiologos inherited was not the golden realm of Justinian or Basil, but a hollow shadow of its former self. Decades of Latin occupation had devastated the economy and emptied the population. Trade routes had fallen under Venetian and Genoese control, leaving Constantinople a dependent city rather than the hub of global commerce it had once been. Its neighborhoods were scarred by fire and neglect. The palaces looted, the churches stripped of relics. To rebuild, Michael turned to diplomacy and deception as much as war. He forged alliances with Italian city-states, manipulated rivalries among the Crusaders, and even negotiated with the papacy to prevent another Latin assault. But his pragmatism came at a heavy price. In 1274, at the Council of Lyons, he agreed to a union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, not from conviction, but to gain Western recognition. To the Byzantine people, this was unforgivable. They saw it as betrayal of the faith their ancestors had defended for centuries. Monks cursed him, priests refused communion in his name, and rebellions erupted across the provinces. Michael suppressed them brutally, his soldiers burning monasteries that opposed him. In his later years, he ruled in paranoia, haunted by the very alliance that had saved his empire. When he died in 1282, he left behind a weary people, loyal to orthodoxy, distrustful of the West, and bound to an empire that no longer controlled its destiny. The city was Byzantine again, but the soul of Byzantium had begun to fade. Michael's son, Andronikos II Palaiologos, inherited a fragile empire teetering between hope and decay. Deeply pious but indecisive, he reversed his father's controversial church union, restoring orthodoxy's independence and earning the people's devotion. Yet his reign marked the beginning of irreversible decline. The imperial treasury was empty, and to save costs, Andronikos disbanded the navy, a catastrophic mistake for a maritime empire surrounded by enemies. The Genoese and Venetians now ruled the Aegean trade, while piracy spread like wildfire along the coasts. In Asia Minor, Turkish warlords, descendants of the Seljuk tribes, advanced relentlessly, conquering Byzantine towns with little resistance. Cities like Prusa and Nicaea, once the empire's proud centers, fell one by one. Refugees flooded into Constantinople, turning the capital into a city of beggars and broken families. The emperor sought help from the Catalan Company, a band of hardened mercenaries from Spain, led by the ruthless Roger de Flor. At first, they crushed the Turks with brutal efficiency, but soon they turned on their employers, ravaging the countryside and seizing Byzantine lands for themselves. Civil war followed, as the emperor's grandson, Andronikos III, rebelled against him. Father fought son, noble fought noble, while the empire's borders collapsed. By the time Andronikos II died in 1332, the Byzantines controlled little more than Constantinople, parts of Thrace, and fragments of Greece. The once mighty Roman state had become a relic, a city-state pretending to be an empire. Yet its culture, faith, and art remained luminous. Within the decaying walls, scholars preserve the last light of Hellenic wisdom, translating Aristotle, refining theology, and painting icons whose quiet radiance defied the encroaching darkness. The empire's body was dying, but its spirit still glowed, like a candle flickering in the wind. The 14th century plunged Byzantium into its final torment, an age of internal wars, foreign interventions, and creeping conquest. Under Andronikos III and his successor, John V Palaiologos, the empire fought to survive in a world transformed. The Ottoman Turks, once minor frontier lords, had united under a new dynasty led by Osman and his son Orhan. Swiftly, methodically, they expanded across Asia Minor, seizing the last Byzantine fortresses and crossing into Europe in 1354. The fall of Gallipoli was a death knell. For the first time, the Turks had set foot on European soil. Byzantium was now trapped between East and West, between Islam's advance and Latin exploitation. The empire's rulers, desperate for aid, turned again to the West, offering union with the Catholic Church in exchange for soldiers. But the people, scarred by memories of 1204, rejected such bargains. Meanwhile, internal strife tore the empire apart. Rival emperors, John V, John VI Cannivizanos, and later their sons, plunged Constantinople into endless civil wars, hiring Turkish mercenaries who would later devour the very lands they fought over. By mid-century, the empire had shrunk to a handful of coastal towns, while the Ottomans encircled it like a tightening noose. Yet amid the ruin, Byzantine intellect reached one last flowering. Philosophers such as Gemistos Plethin revived ancient Greek humanism. Theologians like Gregory Palamas debated the nature of divine light. Artists filled monasteries with frescoes that seemed to glow with heavenly sorrow. The empire's spirit became mystical, introspective, no longer seeking to rule the world, but to understand its end. As the 14th century waned, Constantinople still stood, proud, wounded, and alone, the last ember of Rome flickering against the coming storm. In the twilight of the 14th century, as Byzantium languished in decay, a new empire was awakening across the plains of Anatolia, a power forged in discipline, faith, and conquest. These were the Ottoman Turks, descendants of nomadic warriors who had once served the Seljuks as frontier guardians. Under their founder Osman I, they built a principality on the ruins of Byzantine towns, uniting Turkish tribes under the banner of Islam. His successors, especially Orhan and Murad I, transformed that small principality into a state with a clear destiny: the conquest of Constantinople and the unification of the Islamic East. Unlike earlier invaders, the Ottomans were not mere raiders. They built fortresses, organized administration, and absorbed the populations they conquered. Their secret weapon was discipline, both spiritual and military. The new system of devshirm, or child levy, recruited Christian boys from conquered lands, converting them to Islam and training them as the elite janissaries, soldiers who knew no loyalty except to the Sultan. These warriors, armed with precision, faith, and firepower, became the backbone of the rising Ottoman state. As the Byzantines struggled with civil wars and religious disputes, the Ottomans steadily advanced, capturing Bursa, Nicaea, and Nicomedia, cities that had once been the heart of Byzantine Asia. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the fortress of Gallipoli, allowing the Ottomans to seize it. From there, they crossed into Europe, establishing a permanent foothold in Thrace. Byzantium, once the guardian of Christendom, now found the roles reversed, its emperor forced to pay tribute to a Muslim sultan. The Roman eagle had become the vassal of the Crescent. The ancient world was changing, and the heirs of Constantine now lived under the shadow of Osman's sons. Under Sultan Murad I and later Bayezid I, the Ottoman advance became an unstoppable tide sweeping through the Balkans. One by one, the Christian kingdoms of southeastern Europe fell under their control. Bulgaria was subdued, Serbia was shattered at the Battle of Kosovo, 1389, and Wallachia barely survived as a tributary state. The Ottoman armies, disciplined and relentless, combined steppe cavalry tactics with advanced siege warfare. Their use of gunpowder and mobile artillery gave them a terrifying edge over medieval fortresses. The Byzantine emperors, powerless to resist, relied on diplomacy, tribute, and prayer. John V Palaiologos, once the ruler of the Second Rome, journeyed to Rome itself to beg for help, even agreeing to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Yet the West, weary of crusades and divided by its own politics, offered only empty promises. Meanwhile, the Ottomans continued their encirclement of Constantinople, establishing outposts on both sides of the Bosporus and cutting off the city's last access to its Asian provinces. By the time Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt, reigned, the empire had been reduced to a few miles beyond its capital's walls. In 1394, he laid siege to Constantinople itself, a siege that lasted nearly 8 years. Only the miraculous intervention of another conqueror saved the city. Timur the Lame, the Mongol Turkic warlord who defeated Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. The Ottoman state temporarily collapsed into civil war, and Constantinople, for a moment, breathed again. Yet even in reprieve, Byzantium was dying. Its economy was ruined, its people starving, its once golden domes tarnished with age. The city was no longer an empire, but a memory, a relic guarded by faith alone. The respite would not last. The Ottomans would return, stronger, more organized, and more determined than ever to claim the prize that had eluded Islam for 8 centuries, the city of Constantine. In the 15th century, Byzantium became a ghost empire, majestic but hollow, defiant yet resigned to fate. The last emperors of the Palaiologos dynasty, Manuel II and John VIII, struggled to preserve what little remained through diplomacy and desperate appeals to the West. Manuel too traveled across Europe, pleading before kings and popes for aid. He impressed the courts of Paris and London with his eloquence and wisdom, but his words could not overcome Western apathy. The Latin world saw Byzantium as an outdated remnant, a relic of a bygone age. Meanwhile, the Ottomans recovered from their civil strife, emerging under Mehmed I and Murad II stronger than before. Their armies reclaimed lost lands, their fleets dominated the Aegean, and their spies infiltrated the very heart of Constantinople. When John VIII succeeded Manuel, he made one final gamble. In 1439, at the Council of Florence, he agreed to reunite the Eastern and Western churches in exchange for military aid. Yet the Byzantine people, fiercely Orthodox, rejected the union as heresy. The city's clergy preached that divine help, not Latin armies, would save them. But heaven remained silent. The Ottomans under Murad II besieged Constantinople once again, but withdrew after a costly struggle. For a moment, it seemed the city might survive a little longer. But destiny had already chosen its instrument, a young, brilliant, and relentless sultan named Mehmed II, who would soon earn the title Fatih, the Conqueror. As the 15th century neared its end, the crescent moon rose higher above the horizon, its light gleaming coldly upon the ancient walls of Theodosius. Within those walls, a handful of Byzantines prepared to face the end of their world, not with surrender, but with the unshakable faith that had defined them for 1,000 years. In the spring of 1453, the world held its breath. Two men stood at the edge of destiny. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, and Sultan Mehmed II, the young ruler of the rising Ottoman Empire. Constantine, weary yet unyielding, ruled a broken city that had once governed continents. His empire now consisted of little more than Constantinople and a few scattered territories in Greece. But in him burned the spirit of Rome, the belief that faith and duty were worth dying for. Mehmed, only 21, was his opposite in every way. Youthful, ambitious, and filled with an almost prophetic conviction that it was his divine mission to capture the ancient city. From his palace in Edirne, he assembled one of the greatest armies the medieval world had ever seen. Nearly 80,000 soldiers, including elite janissaries, Anatolian cavalry, and artillery crews commanded by engineers from across Europe. At the heart of his siege arsenal stood the monstrous cannon built by the Hungarian gunsmith Orban, a weapon so vast it could hurl stone balls weighing half a ton across the Golden Horn. As the Ottoman fleet assembled in the Sea of Marmara, its sails darkened the horizon like storm clouds. Constantinople, still encircled by the mighty Theodosian walls, had only 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese, commanded by Constantine and the brave Italian captain Giovanni Giustiniani. Supplies were scarce, morale thin, but faith unbroken. Priests led processions through the streets, bearing icons of the Virgin, while citizens prayed beneath crumbling mosaics for divine intervention. The city that had once called itself the eye of the world prepared for its final trial. Both men, emperor and sultan, knew that what was about to unfold would decide not merely the fate of a city, but the course of civilizations. On April 6th, 1453, the Ottoman cannons roared to life, and the world seemed to shake. The walls of Constantinople, which had defied countless sieges for 1,000 years, now faced the thunder of gunpowder. Day after day, Mehmed's artillery battered the ancient stones, reducing towers and gates to rubble. The defenders fought with desperate courage, repairing breaches at night, firing arrows and primitive cannons, and repelling assaults with boiling oil and stones. On the sea, the Byzantines hoped their great chain across the Golden Horn would block the Ottoman navy, but Mehmed outwitted them. In a stunning feat of engineering, his men dragged 70 ships overland on grease logs, bypassing the chain and launching them into the harbor behind the city's defenses. Panic spread within the walls. Yet Constantine refused to yield. He moved among his soldiers, encouraging them as both emperor and comrade. "We fight for faith, for freedom, for our families," he declared. "And if we must die, let us die as men." The defenders' valor inspired awe even among the besiegers. Each failed assault cost the Ottomans thousands of lives, but the young sultan pressed on relentlessly. Inside the city, famine and exhaustion took their toll. Churches became hospitals. The Hagia Sophia echoed with prayers and tears. On May 28th, the eve of the final attack, the citizens gathered one last time within its sacred walls. Greeks and Latins, divided for centuries by theology, prayed together in unity, a moment of reconciliation born from despair. As candles flickered under the great dome, the last emperor of Byzantium received communion and whispered to his people, "I will not leave you. I will die with you." Outside, the Ottoman army prepared for dawn, their drums and chants rising like a tide that would soon swallow the city of Constantine. At dawn on May 29th, 1453, the final assault began. The ground trembled under the marching of tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers. Wave after wave struck the shattered walls. Anatolian irregulars first, then regular troops, and finally the elite janissaries, chanting the name of God as they advanced through smoke and fire. The defenders fought with unmatched valor. Emperor Constantine XI, his armor gleaming beneath a torn banner of the cross, led the charge at the Mesopotamian breach. For hours, the battle raged in chaos, swords clashing, cannon smoke choking the air, screams echoing across the moat. When the Genoese Captain Giustiniani was wounded and carried away, panic rippled through the defenders. The emperor, realizing the city was lost, tore off his imperial regalia and plunged into the fray, disappearing beneath the crush of soldiers. His body was never found. The gates fell. Ottoman banners rose above the walls. The city that had withstood Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Bulgars, the city that had outlasted Rome itself, finally succumbed. As the sun climbed higher, Mem II entered through the gate of St. Romanus. He dismounted, gazed upon the ruins, and whispered, "There is no God but God. Muhammad is his prophet." Then he ordered the Hagia Sophia cleansed and converted into a mosque, a gesture both of reverence and triumph. The sack of the city lasted 3 days. Sorrow and horror mingled with awe at the conquest. Yet Mem forbade its total destruction, declaring Constantinople his new capital. Istanbul, the bridge between worlds. The Byzantine Empire was gone, but its legacy endured in Orthodox faith, in art and learning, and in the very empire that conquered it. The fall of Constantinople marked not just the end of Byzantium, but the end of the Middle Ages. The last light of the ancient world flickered out, and a new world, Ottoman and modern, began to rise from its ashes. When Constantinople fell in 1453, it was not only an empire that perished, but a vast treasury of knowledge, art, and philosophy that scattered like seeds upon the wind. As Ottoman soldiers swept through the broken city, scholars, monks, and artists fled across the seas, carrying with them the manuscripts, memories, and intellectual treasures of 1,000 years of civilization. Many found refuge in Italy, where their arrival would ignite one of the greatest transformations in human history, the Renaissance. The West, long starved of Greek learning, now drank deeply from the Byzantine well. Refugee scholars like Bessarion, Chrysoloras, and Gemistos Plethin brought with them the complete works of Plato, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers, along with maps, astronomical tables, and mathematical treatises that have been preserved in Byzantine libraries. Italian humanists, inspired by their brilliance, began to see themselves as heirs to both Rome and Byzantium. The rediscovery of classical Greek thought rekindled Europe's intellectual fire, reshaping art, science, and philosophy. The architecture of Florence, the theology of Erasmus, and even the vision of Columbus all bore the fingerprints of Byzantine influence. Yet this intellectual migration was not just a transfer of books, It was a transmission of spirit. The Byzantines had lived for centuries balancing faith with reason, art with theology, empire with eternity. Their synthesis of classical and Christian thought gave Europe the tools to merge beauty with truth. Thus, even as the empire's walls crumbled, its mind survived, flowing westward to awaken the world it had once called barbarian. The Renaissance was, in many ways, Byzantium's final triumph. Knowledge rising from ruins, light reborn from loss. While the West inherited Byzantine wisdom, the East inherited its faith. Though the empire had fallen, the Orthodox Church, its spiritual heart, endured. Under Ottoman rule, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople became the recognized leader of all Orthodox Christians within the Sultan's dominions. The Church adapted to survive, preserving its rites, language, and theology even in subjugation. The liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, sung in the language of the emperors, continued to echo in darkened chapels across Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Russia. Icons, those luminous windows into heaven, remained the visual scripture of the Orthodox world, their colors whispering of eternity amid oppression. Beyond the empire's ashes, new centers of orthodoxy arose. In Moscow, the grand princes and patriarchs declared their city the Third Rome, heir to both Rome and Constantinople. Two Romes have fallen, proclaimed the monk Philotheus of Pskov, but the third stands, and there will be no fourth. The Russian Tsars adopted Byzantine titles, imperial symbols, and even the double-headed eagle, claiming to carry forward the legacy of the Christian Empire. From the monasteries of Mount Athos to the churches of Kiev, Byzantine spirituality continued to shape art, music, and mysticism. The Orthodox concept of theosis, the union of man with the divine, became a defining feature of Eastern Christian theology. Even under centuries of Ottoman domination, the Byzantine faith did not vanish. It adapted, endured, and eventually inspired national revivals across the Balkans. In its quiet resilience lay the empire's truest victory, not of armies or politics, but of spirit. The cross of Byzantium still shone, not from a throne of marble, but from the hearts of its faithful. Though the Byzantine Empire fell, its influence is woven into the fabric of modern civilization, in law, architecture, religion, and governance. Byzantium preserved and transmitted Roman law, the Greek language, and Christian theology, ensuring that Europe's intellectual lineage remained unbroken. The Justinian Code, once compiled in the 6th century, became the foundation of civil law in many European nations. The majestic domes of Hagia Sophia inspired the great mosques of Istanbul and the cathedrals of the Renaissance alike. In art, Byzantine mosaics, with their gold backgrounds and ethereal figures, shaped the visual vocabulary of sacred beauty for both East and West. The empire's administrative system, its bureaucracy, diplomacy, and civil service, foreshadowed the structure of modern states. But Byzantium's greatest legacy lay not in marble or parchment, but in the idea of continuity. It had preserved the essence of the ancient world through centuries of chaos, serving as a bridge between antiquity and modernity, between pagan philosophy and Christian faith, between Rome and Europe. Even today, its echoes are everywhere, in the domes of Orthodox churches, in the codes of law, in the language of theology, and in the art of iconography. Byzantium taught the world that civilization could endure not by conquest alone, but by faith, intellect, and adaptability. The empire may have fallen to the sword, but its heart never died. In the words of the historian Stephen Runciman, Byzantium was not just a state, it was a vision of order, harmony, and divine purpose. That vision still lingers in the stones of Istanbul, in the hymns of orthodoxy, and in every dream of unity between heaven and earth. Byzantium's body was mortal, but its soul was eternal. Long before the flames of 1453, Byzantium had already built a fortress more enduring than stone, the fortress of knowledge. In the quiet chambers of monasteries, beneath flickering oil lamps, generations of monks became the custodians of human civilization. They copied by hand the works of Homer, Sophocles, Plato, and Aristotle. They preserved the medical treatises of Galen and the mathematical theories of Euclid. While Western Europe lay in the shadows of the Dark Ages, these Byzantine scribes safeguarded the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. Monasteries such as Staudios in Constantinople and Mount Athos became centers of learning, where scripture and science coexisted in harmony. The act of copying was not merely academic, it was sacred. Each manuscript was a prayer in ink, a bridge between the temporal and the eternal. The Byzantine conviction that truth, whether divine or rational, was part of God's order kept alive the flame of classical thought that might otherwise have vanished forever. When the empire fell and scholars fled westward, they carried with them these priceless texts. Not relics, but living seeds that would bloom again in the Italian Renaissance. Humanist scholars in Florence and Venice pored over manuscripts of Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, and Ptolemy's Geography, all preserved through Byzantine care. Without these unseen guardians, Europe's intellectual rebirth might never have come. Thus, even in decline, Byzantium's silent scribes achieved what armies and emperors could not: the immortality of wisdom. The fall of cities mattered little when the empire's true treasure, the written word, had already crossed the seas. In Byzantine art, beauty was not an ornament, it was revelation. Every mosaic, every icon, every hymn was a declaration that heaven was real and near. The empire saw art not as decoration, but as theology expressed through color, sound, and form. The icon, that uniquely Byzantine creation, was more than a painting. It was a window into eternity. Artists did not sign their names, for they were not creators, but vessels of divine inspiration. Gold backgrounds symbolized the light of heaven. Elongated faces and still eyes reflected inner peace beyond the turmoil of the world. In a Hagia Sophia, sunlight streamed through 40 windows beneath the dome, creating the illusion that the building itself floated between earth and sky. This interplay of light and structure became a symbol of the divine presence descending upon humankind. Byzantine composers also forged a new kind of music, a haunting blend of Greek modes and Christian chant that echoed like the voices of angels across marble halls. Every service, every mural, every architectural design served the same purpose: to unite the soul with the divine. This aesthetic vision shaped the art of both East and West. The mosaics of Ravenna, the domes of Venice, and even the paintings of early Renaissance masters like Giotto and Fra Angelico carried traces of Byzantine light. In the Orthodox East, the tradition lived on unbroken, its forms refined but never replaced. To gaze upon a Byzantine icon today is to stand within the same mystical continuum, where beauty becomes truth and art becomes prayer. In this luminous vision, Byzantium achieved what no empire of swords could: a union of the material and the eternal. The intellectual legacy of Byzantium was not confined to theology or art. It was also profoundly philosophical. The Byzantines inherited the rationalism of Greece and the spirituality of Christianity, and they sought to reconcile them through reasoned faith. Thinkers like John of Damascus, Photios the Great and Michael Sellos explored the boundaries between divine revelation and human intellect, laying the groundwork for both medieval scholasticism and later humanism. Their writings on metaphysics, ethics, and logic influenced not only the Eastern Church, but also Western philosophers who rediscovered them centuries later. The Byzantine belief in the Logos, the divine word that structured the universe, anticipated modern ideas about natural law and cosmic order. In medicine, scholars such as Orobasius and Paul of Aegina preserved and expanded Greek medical science, while engineers designed mechanical marvels, from hydraulic organs to the legendary Greek fire, blending artistry with applied science. The empire's bureaucratic system, based on merit and documentation, foreshadowed the modern civil service. Even in decline, Byzantine thought influenced the early universities of Western Europe through translations made in Italy and Spain. What emerged was a world that no longer saw faith and reason as enemies, but as twin lights guiding humanity. Byzantium's genius lay in its balance. It refused to separate the sacred from the intellectual or the earthly from the spiritual. That synthesis became one of the foundations of modern civilization. In the words of later scholars, Byzantium was the mind of antiquity clothed in the soul of Christianity. Its empire may have ended in 1453, but its worldview, rational, luminous, and eternal, continues to shape the conscience of humankind. When the Ottoman banners rose above Constantinople's walls in 1453, it seemed as though the light of the Christian East had been extinguished forever. Yet in truth, Byzantium did not die. It transformed. Under Ottoman rule, the Orthodox Church became both prisoner and protector of its people. Sultan Mehmed II, though a conqueror, understood the power of faith as a tool of governance. He reinstated the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople, appointing Gennadios Scholarios as the new patriarch. This decision made the Orthodox Church the official representative of all Christians within the empire, a system known as the Millet. The patriarch was both religious leader and civil administrator, responsible for law, marriage, and education among his flock. While it granted a fragile autonomy, it also bound the church to the Ottoman state. Heavy taxes burdened Christians. Churches were converted to mosques, and young boys were taken through the Devshirme system to become janissaries, soldiers of the Sultan. Yet despite oppression, the flame of faith endured. In secret chapels and mountain monasteries, priests whispered the liturgy in Greek and Slavonic. Icons were hidden behind curtains. Hymns were sung in defiance of silence. The Orthodox faith became the anchor of identity, the last remnant of a fallen empire and a living symbol of resistance. Though the Romans had lost their city, they had not lost their soul. The faith that once crowned emperors now sustained peasants, reminding them that Byzantium lived not in palaces or armies, but in the hearts of believers. The cross had fallen from the Hagia Sophia, but it still shone in the minds of those who remembered who they were. For centuries after the conquest, education among the Orthodox was forbidden or tightly controlled by the Ottoman authorities. But the Greeks, Armenians, and Slavs refused to let ignorance extinguish their inheritance. Thus were born the Kryphoscolia, the hidden schools. Conducted in caves, basements, and remote monasteries, these clandestine classrooms kept alive the Greek language, the scriptures, and the legacy of Hellenic philosophy. Priests became teachers, icons became textbooks, and candlelight replaced torches of empire. Through these secret lessons, the spirit of Byzantium continued to shape new generations. Knowledge was no longer a privilege of emperors, but a weapon of endurance. The church played a crucial role in this silent renaissance. Monasteries in Mount Athos, Meteora, and Patmos preserved libraries filled with manuscripts that had escaped Ottoman destruction. The monks who guarded these texts were the last philosophers of an unbroken lineage that stretched back to Aristotle. Meanwhile, in the distant Orthodox world, in Moldavia, Russia, Serbia, and Bulgaria, Byzantine art and liturgy flourished anew. Frescoes depicting the Last Judgment and the Mother of God became acts of defiance, declaring that divine truth could not be conquered. Even Ottoman scholars, fascinated by Greek learning, translated ancient works into Arabic and Persian, unknowingly spreading Byzantine intellectual heritage further east. Thus, the empire's memory became immortal, not through armies or politics, but through education, devotion, and the written word. In every hidden classroom where a child whispered the Greek alphabet, in every icon painted by trembling hands, Byzantium lived again, a silent resurrection repeated across centuries of darkness. By the 18th century, the Ottoman grip over southeastern Europe began to weaken, and with it emerged a new force, national consciousness, deeply rooted in Byzantine tradition. The church, once confined to prayer and ritual, became the cradle of rebellion. Priests preached not only salvation, but also remembrance, reminding their flocks that they were descendants of emperors, saints, and scholars. The liturgy, chanted in ancient Greek or Church Slavonic, became a bridge to a glorious past that inspired hope for the future. In Greece, this awakening took the form of Filiki Eteria, the Society of Friends, founded in 1814, whose members dreamed of restoring a free Christian state. The language of their revolution was drenched in Byzantine imagery. They called their struggle the resurrection of the Romans. When the Greek War of Independence erupted in 1821, many fighters carried icons of the Virgin Mary, the same Theotokos once invoked by Byzantine emperors in battle. The revolution succeeded, and by 1830, modern Greece was born. Elsewhere, the same spirit stirred. Serbian uprisings, Bulgarian church movements, and Romanian cultural revivals all drew from the well of Byzantine orthodoxy. Even in Russia, which had long proclaimed itself the Third Rome, rulers like Catherine the Great and Nicholas I invoked Byzantine imagery to legitimize their authority. The Byzantine ideal of a divinely ordained Christian civilization had survived the fall of Constantinople and found new life in nations rising from centuries of subjugation. In every cathedral dome, in every Easter chant of Christos Anesti, the empire spoke again, not in the language of conquest, but in the universal grammar of faith. Byzantium's body had been buried beneath Ottoman stone, but its soul had already crossed into eternity, waiting for the dawn. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, a tremor of grief rippled through the Christian East. Yet far to the north, in the forests of Rus, that grief ignited a vision. In the city of Moscow, princes and monks began to speak of a destiny that would outlast the ruin of Byzantium. For centuries, the Kievan Rus had looked to Constantinople as their mother church. In 988, Prince Vladimir the Great had accepted Christianity from Byzantine missionaries, baptizing his people in the waters of the Dnieper River. With that act, the soul of Byzantium had been transplanted into Slavic soil. Now, with the Second Rome destroyed, the Russians saw themselves as its spiritual heirs. The monk Philotheus of Pskov proclaimed in the early 16th century, "Two Romes have fallen. The third stands, and there will be no fourth." The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome was not mere rhetoric. It became a guiding ideology. The Russian rulers adopted Byzantine symbols. The double-headed eagle for sovereignty over East and West. The titles are derived from Caesar and the vision of an Orthodox empire chosen by God. When Ivan III married Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, the symbolic union was complete. Byzantine court rituals, architecture, and theology blended with Slavic traditions to forge a new imperial identity. Moscow's cathedrals, designed by Italian architects but crowned with onion domes of golden fire, became a northern echo of Constantinople's splendor. The fall of one empire had seeded the birth of another. Through the Russians, the Byzantine dream of a Christian state guided by divine purpose found new life amid the snows of the north. The torch of orthodoxy had passed from the Bosporus to the Moskva River, and its flame would burn for centuries. In Byzantium, the ideal of symphonia, harmony between emperor and church, had defined political theology for 1,000 years. In Moscow, this ideal was reborn with fervent intensity. The Tsar was seen not merely as a monarch, but as the protector of the faith, the earthly image of divine order. The Church, in turn, sanctified his rule as part of God's providence. This Byzantine inheritance gave Russia a sense of spiritual destiny unparalleled in Europe. Under Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, the concept of sacred autocracy reached its zenith. Though his reign was marked by terror and bloodshed, Ivan believed himself to be God's chosen guardian of orthodoxy, waging holy wars against heretics and infidels alike. The coronation rituals of the Tsars mirrored those of the Byzantine emperors, anointing with holy chrism, blessings from the patriarch, and the crowning beneath domes adorned with mosaics of Christ Pantocrator. The patriarchal throne of Moscow became, in the eyes of the faithful, the continuation of the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, now silenced under Ottoman rule. The synergy of church and state gave Russia both moral authority and imperial ambition. As the Byzantine emperors had once seen themselves as guardians of the Christian world, so too did the Tsars. The conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan was hailed not only as political expansion, but as the triumph of the cross over the crescent. Even the art and iconography of Russia reflected this inherited grandeur. Icons glowed with the same Byzantine serenity, while choirs chanted hymns in the ancient mode of Hagia Sophia. Moscow was no longer merely a city. It was a mission, a metaphysical empire charged with defending the Orthodox faith and preserving the light of Byzantium in an age of darkness. The concept of Moscow as the Third Rome transcended politics. It became a spiritual worldview that would shape Russian identity for centuries. The Byzantines had always believed that empire was not just a form of government, but a reflection of divine order, a living symbol of heaven on earth. In Russia, this belief evolved into a moral and mystical vision. Monks and theologians saw the Tsar's realm as the last bastion of true Christianity, surrounded by a fallen and heretical world. This conviction bred both pride and burden. The sense that Russia had inherited not only Byzantium's glory, but also its destiny of suffering and endurance. Artists and architects translated this into form. The Kremlin became a microcosm of New Rome, its cathedrals crowned with golden domes like celestial flames. Icons such as Andrei Rublev's Trinity embodied the synthesis of Byzantine theology and Russian soul, where divine mystery met human compassion. Yet the dream of the Third Rome also carried contradictions. It gave rise to spiritual depth, but also to autocratic power, to religious unity, but also to isolation from the West. Still, through wars, reforms, and revolutions, the Byzantine inheritance remained unbroken. Even in the 20th century, when empires fell and faith was persecuted, the echoes of Byzantium could still be heard in Russian liturgies, in the melodies of Orthodox choirs, in the domes that glimmered above snowbound towns. The idea of sacred destiny, born in Constantinople, reborn in Moscow, had outlived both emperors and sultans. It reminded the world that Byzantium was more than a place in time. It was a continuum of faith, beauty, and divine aspiration. The empire had changed form, but its spirit, like the eternal flame of an oil lamp, still burned bright across the centuries, illuminating the path between heaven and earth. Centuries after the fall of Constantinople, the world began to rediscover the empire it had once misunderstood. For much of medieval Europe, Byzantium had been dismissed as decadent, a realm of intrigue, ceremony, and superstition. But as Western scholars and travelers ventured into the Ottoman lands during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, they were stunned by what they found. The ruins of marble cities, the glitter of mosaics, and the haunting beauty of the Hagia Sophia. Artists, poets, and historians of the 19th century began to see Byzantium not as a relic of decline, but as a bridge between antiquity and modernity. British travelers like Lord Byron and Robert Curzon wandered through forgotten monasteries, describing shimmering icons and faded frescoes that seemed alive with divine light. French and German historians, influenced by Romanticism, reimagined the Byzantine world as a lost paradise of mysticism and grandeur. Painters such as Gustave Doré and Jean-Léon Gérôme captured scenes of imperial splendor and tragic decline. Emperors beneath golden domes, monks fleeing burning libraries, and processions of light fading into shadow. This revival of fascination reshaped Europe's understanding of its own roots. The West began to realize that its Renaissance, its art, even its faith had all drawn nourishment from Byzantine soil. Archaeologists uncovered the mosaics of Ravenna and Daphne, while scholars in Oxford and Paris translated the chronicles of Anna Comnene and Procopius. The ghost empire of the East slowly regained its dignity, no longer dismissed as decadent, but revered as the preserver of civilization during centuries when the West had slept. Byzantium, once vilified, now glimmered again in the imagination of Europe, its beauty eternal, its tragedy sublime. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Neo-Byzantine revival swept across Europe and beyond, a movement that sought to recapture the empire's timeless fusion of faith and art. Architects, painters, and theologians found in Byzantine aesthetics a language of transcendence, a harmony between spiritual and material form that modern industrial society seemed to have lost. In Russia, churches like Saint Savior on the Spilled Blood in St. Petersburg and the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow rose in shimmering splendor, their mosaics glowing with gold and sapphire. In Western Europe, the movement took root as well. The Basilica of Sacré-Cœur in Paris and Westminster Cathedral in London both echoed the domes and iconography of Constantinople. Even in the young United States, architects embraced the Byzantine style. The Cathedral of St. Louis in Missouri and the Greek Orthodox churches of New York became modern testaments to an ancient art. These creations were not mere imitations. They were acts of homage. The Neo-Byzantine movement expressed humanity's longing for sacred beauty in an age of steel and steam. Scholars such as Sir Stephen Runciman and Dmitry Obolensky later gave this aesthetic revival a moral and intellectual depth, revealing Byzantium not as a static civilization, but as a living continuum of culture. Through exhibitions, restorations, and museum collections, its art returned to the public eye. The icons once hidden in monasteries became treasured masterpieces of world heritage. The West, which had once destroyed the empire in the Fourth Crusade, now preserved its memory in marble and glass. The Byzantine spirit, luminous, disciplined, and mystical, had found new vessels in the modern age. Every gilded dome, every chant echoing through a cathedral, whispered the same truth. Empires fall, but beauty endures. Beyond art and architecture, Byzantium lived on as an idea, a symbol of endurance, faith, and paradox. In a modern world, nations born from its ashes continued to draw strength from its memory. Greece, newly independent in the 19th century, embraced its Byzantine past as the missing link between ancient glory and modern revival. Intellectuals like Constantine Papargopoulos argued that the Byzantine millennium was not a dark interlude, but a continuation of Hellenic civilization, an era that fused classical reason with Christian faith. In Russia, the Byzantine heritage of orthodoxy and autocracy shaped the soul of the Tsars, and later even influenced the rhetoric of Soviet power, which unconsciously inherited the empire's belief in universal mission. The Balkans, too, carried its legacy in the frescoes of Serbia's monasteries, the chants of Bulgarian choirs, and the ornate diplomacy of modern Orthodox politics. Even the Ottoman Empire, Byzantium's conqueror, became its vessel. Istanbul remained the crossroads of civilizations, where Byzantine roads, cisterns, and domes still shaped daily life. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians and theologians rediscover Byzantium as more than an empire, as a worldview that reconciled opposites. Faith and logic, East and West, empire and spirituality. Modern thinkers saw in it a model for coexistence, a civilization that endured through synthesis rather than conquest. Its art inspired filmmakers, its theology guided ecumenical dialogues, and its endurance became a metaphor for human resilience. The Byzantine dream that beauty, order, and divine purpose could coexist in a broken world continues to haunt modern imagination. In the age of globalization, Byzantium stands as a reminder that true civilization lies not in power, but in the ability to unite spirit and intellect across centuries. The empire is gone, but its idea remains immortal, a mirror of humanity's endless striving toward the eternal. More than any empire before or after, Byzantium existed between worlds, between the ancient and the modern, between the Greek and the Latin, between the cross and the crescent. Though its armies vanished and its palaces turned to dust, its soul never died. Byzantium was never simply a place on a map. It was a bridge in time. It preserved the wisdom of Greece, the law of Rome, and the faith of Christianity, weaving them into a living tapestry that outlasted the centuries. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed under barbarian invasions, it was Byzantium that kept alive the flame of classical learning. When medieval Europe began its slow awakening, it was Byzantine monks, diplomats, and artists who transmitted the forgotten knowledge of antiquity back to the West. Its scholars gave the world not only theology, but also science, art, and philosophy, the tools with which humanity would build modern civilization. The Byzantine diplomat's subtlety, the theologian's logic, the artist's devotion, all these became archetypes for the European mind. Even Islam, which rose as Byzantium's rival, inherited much of its administrative and artistic culture from the empire it conquered. The mosaics of Damascus, the domes of Ottoman Istanbul, the courts of Persian kings, all bore the echo of Byzantine harmony. In that sense, Byzantium was never defeated, it merely transformed. It became the invisible architecture upon which new worlds were built. From Moscow's golden domes to Venice's marble cathedrals, from the Renaissance classroom to the Orthodox liturgy, Byzantium's presence endures, the quiet, luminous thread binding the past to the present. Empires rise and fall, but civilizations that live in the mind and the soul never truly perish. Byzantium was one such civilization, immortal because it taught the world how to unite heaven and earth through beauty, order, and faith. No symbol captures the eternal soul of Byzantium more perfectly than the Hagia Sophia, that colossal church of holy wisdom, the beating heart of the empire for nearly 1,000 years. Built by Emperor Justinian in 537 CE, it stood not only as the largest building of its age, but as the very embodiment of Byzantine vision. Its vast dome, suspended seemingly without support, symbolized the union of heaven and earth. Within its golden interior, light was not just illumination, it was theology. The architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, designed the Hagia Sophia to be a sermon in stone. To stand beneath its dome was to glimpse eternity. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the church was transformed into a mosque, yet its essence survived. The Ottomans, recognizing its majesty, preserved its form, adding minarets that only extended its grandeur skyward. For centuries, it remained a place of worship, first Christian, then Muslim, and in the modern age, a museum open to all. Even today, the Hagia Sophia embodies the paradox of Byzantium, an eternal tension between faiths, empires, and time. Its walls contain layers of history, the prayers of emperors, the chants of imams, the footsteps of scholars and tourists alike. It stands as proof that the human yearning for the divine can outlive conquest and ideology. Every beam of sunlight that filters through its windows carries whispers from the ages, the psalms of monks, the calls of muezzins, the dreams of architects who dared to capture infinity. In its survival, Hagia Sophia tells the true story of Byzantium. That beauty, born of faith and imagination, is indestructible. Long after crowns have rusted and armies faded, its golden dome still gleams against the sky, a silent hymn to the eternity of the human spirit. In the 21st century, the name of Byzantium still evokes awe, a civilization both distant and intimate, both alien and familiar. Its political forms may have vanished, but its moral and intellectual legacies shape our world more than we often realize. The Byzantine concept of universal law survives in modern legal codes. Its idea of diplomacy, built on intelligence, patience, and compromise, remains a model for international relations. The Byzantine fusion of faith and reason, of theology and philosophy, continues to inspire thinkers who seek harmony between science and spirituality. Even its struggles between East and West, faith and empire, unity and division, mirror the dilemmas of our own age. Byzantium teaches that civilization is not measured by wealth or power, but by the ability to preserve meaning in the face of chaos. It reminds us that art and faith can coexist with intellect and logic, that endurance can triumph over conquest, and that truth, though buried, always rises again. In a fragmented modern world, the Byzantine example of synthesis rather than separation stands as a guiding star. Its story is one of resilience, 1,000 years of survival between worlds, of light sustained through darkness. When we look upon a gilded icon, a cathedral dome, or even the concept of Europe itself, we are gazing upon Byzantium's reflection. It was not merely a chapter of history, but the bridge that carried human thought from the ancient to the modern age. As the historian John Julius Norwich once wrote, when Byzantium fell, the world lost a masterpiece, but gained its foundation. The empire of Constantine and Justinian may have vanished in a legend, but its essence endures wherever beauty, wisdom, and faith are joined. That is the true triumph of Byzantium, not in conquest or power, but in eternity. The empire has fallen, yet its light still burns, bright as ever, unending and divine. And so, the 1,000-year journey of Byzantium comes to an end. From Constantine's dream to the fall of Constantinople, we have witnessed the rise of emperors, the clash of faiths, the birth of nations, and the endurance of a people who refused to surrender their soul. The Byzantines taught the world that civilization is not measured by how long an empire lasts, but by what it preserves. They showed that faith and intellect, art and science, beauty and discipline can live together, that the human spirit can stand firm even when marble falls and crowns crumble. The moral of their story is timeless. Greatness is not found in power or conquest. It is found in endurance, in the will to protect truth, beauty, and knowledge even when the world turns dark. Byzantium fell to the sword, but its ideas became immortal. Its art glows in cathedrals and mosques. Its laws guide nations. Its music still echoes in Orthodox choirs, and its light shines quietly in every soul that seeks the union of heaven and earth. Today, as you finish this epic, remember, the empire did not truly end. It lives on in us, in our search for meaning, in our love for beauty, in our faith that truth can outlast time. Thank you for joining this journey through the Byzantine Empire, Rome's Eastern legacy, here on History Teller YT. If you felt the echoes of the past calling you, subscribe, stay with us, and return for more stories where history breathes again. Because on this channel, every fallen empire rises once more, through memory, through voice, through the power of storytelling. Until next time, this is History Teller YT, where the past still speaks.